My name is Juliet Foster. I'm a university lecturer in social psychology in the Department of Psychology at Cambridge University, and I'm also senior tutor of Murray Edwards College in Cambridge. When I was at school, I enjoyed a lot of subjects, which actually I think made it quite difficult for me to decide what I actually wanted to do. And when I was choosing my A-levels, I made a decision to orientate myself more towards arts and humanities subjects, which proved to be something of a problem in the end. I'd always been very interested in psychology, but the advice I got was that if you want to do psychology, you need to focus on the sciences, you need your biology, you need your maths. I was at that particular point, I didn't want to stop history and French and those sorts of things too. So I did those subjects for A-level and I went to university to study modern languages. So I did 2 years of French and Russian, which I loved. But I never let go of the fact that actually psychology was sort of at the heart of what I wanted to be doing. So I came up with this rather ridiculous plan, with hindsight, that I was going to leave university, redo my A-levels, and actually then reapply for psychology. It was at that point, when I was about to embark upon this rather sort of life-changing route, that I discovered social psychology, social and developmental psychology specifically. I was a student at Cambridge, and at that point, within the social and political sciences tripos, you could study social and developmental psychology, you could specialise in that. And that was just a revelation, because actually when I started reading within social psychology and within developmental psychology, I realised this is exactly what I wanted to be doing. It covered all the kinds of questions I was interested in, and the topics just really grabbed me. So rather than leaving university, I changed subject, and I did finish my degree in social and developmental psychology, went on to do my master's in social psychology, went on to do my PhD in social psychology, so I haven't really looked back. But it allowed me, I think, to keep a lot of the analytical skills that I'd developed in the subjects that I had focused on before, especially in history, in English. It allowed me to kind of develop those further. And I work in social psychology now with a theory that originated in France, so I've kept up the French as well. So, you know, it all worked out in the end. Yeah, so I've got different strands to my research at the moment. What I've always been interested in is the way people understand the world around them. And I'm particularly interested in this not being just an isolated individual activity. I don't see knowledge and understanding as something which we own personally as individuals. What I'm interested in is how within our social groups, within our communities, within our societies, we develop these shared understandings, how we draw on those shared understandings in making sense of new situations, new concepts with which we come into contact. And so as part of that, I've done a lot of work using a theory called the theory of social representations, which draws very heavily on this idea of common sense understanding, the development, the genesis, the changing of representations and understanding within society. But very much, as I say, seeing this as something which, you know, which happens within groups, between individuals, rather than, you know, within particular individuals. I've always been interested in understandings of health and illness. A lot of my work has focused in particular on the understandings that different groups within society have of mental health and illness. I've done work looking at how people who've been diagnosed with a mental health problem understand that diagnosis, how it affects their interaction with mental health services, with those around them. Done work looking at the kind of general public's understanding of mental health problems. Lots of work looking at the stigmatisation of mental health problems, why that might be, how some of the health education campaigns and so on have tried to change those forms of understanding. So I'm continuing to work in that area, but I'm also increasingly looking now at representations and understanding of ageing as well. I've worked with some students recently on concepts such as well-being in ageing, and how you might end up with different ideas about what constitutes healthy ageing amongst different groups. So professionals might have a different idea from older adults themselves, and so on. And I've also been doing some work on looking at the relationship between social psychology and history, which I guess kind of comes right the way back to my original interest in some ways. So I've, possibly unusually for a social psychologist, I've been doing some archive research looking at records of psychiatric hospitals in particular. I was involved in a very interdisciplinary project looking at looking at performance in psychiatric spaces, and my angle on that was to try and look at how these understandings, past understandings, influenced approaches to treatment, influenced the different interactions within the hospitals and so on. So yes, as I say, I went back to the archives for 3 particular hospitals and looked at those, and the plan is that we're hoping to take that work forward and, as I say, examine the relationship between social psychology and history and what they might be able to contribute to each other in a bit more depth. It's an interesting time for social and developmental psychology. I think one of the most interesting things at the moment that's happening is we're seeing a number of social psychologists in particular approaching some of the classic studies within social psychology and revisiting them and reinterpreting them to some extent. I mean, if you look through any textbook of social psychology, you tend to come up with the same studies, the same examples, tend to kind of get used right the way through the ages. So you've got Stanley Milgram and obedience to authority. You've got Zimbardo's prison experiment. If you're thinking about group influences, you might look at the story of Kitty Genovese's murder and so on. It's always the same examples that get used right the way through. And what we've seen in the last few years is psychologists becoming interested in whether there is only one way of understanding those particular examples, those particular studies. And there's been quite a lot of challenge actually of a lot of the conclusions of those studies. So you have some great work that's been coming through looking at the Milgram archive. Stephen Gibson, Alex Haslam, Steve Riker, they've been doing some great work actually looking at other ways of interpreting what actually went on in Milgram's experiments. Similar actually with Zimbardo's prison experiment as well. And actually what we find is that some of these examples, some of these things which we've kind of held to be the sort of the truths within social psychology, need questioning. The story of Kitty Genovese, as I say, which is included in any textbook about how when people are in groups, when there's many people, you don't act as you should. If you're an individual, you would step in to save somebody. But if there's this diffusion of responsibility. And actually, when you look at the facts, Rachel Manning's done some great work which shows that the actual facts of the Kitty Genovese story are really quite different from the way they get reported in textbooks. So I think that's really interesting that there's this attempt to revisit things. And the thread that runs right the way through that, I think, is about questioning how we see the relationship between the individual and wider society, the individual and the group. Because there's been a very long tendency within social psychology to always see the group, the crowd, as being a negative influence on the individual. If you are only able to be, yourself and to sort of, act in accordance with your own norms and values and so on, then you do what was right. But as soon as you bring in other people, as soon as you bring in the group, there's a negative influence. What all of these reinterpretations are doing is actually saying, well, there's something more to group life and the way that groups actually operate, which we need to understand as social psychologists more. It's about the way we categorise ourselves, it's about the way we form groups, it's about the way that we actually develop our identities from the groups of whom we are a member, and actually trying to understand that from the perspective of not always assuming the worst when it comes to the group, has been, I think, a real kind of shift in social psychology more recently. There are not necessarily, for most psychology courses, it's useful to have certain subjects. So it's always going to be, maths and biology are always going to be useful. It's useful to have subjects where you are encouraged to analyse. As I say, the humanities, having some humanities subjects in there as well can be really useful as well. But actually, I think it's about what you do outside of your courses, which almost becomes more important. There's a huge number of people who are interested in studying psychology. So actually thinking how you develop your own interest, your own enthusiasm, and how you set yourself apart from other people is really, really critical. always challenging what you're reading more than you have to. There are, enormous numbers of resources out there now. You can watch entire lecture courses, on YouTube. You can access so much material. So doing that, being really proactive in doing that, going beyond what you're being asked to do in the classroom. And not just doing it for the sake of it, but really thinking, okay, how does that fit in with what I learnt on this particular course? Psychology is an incredibly divided discipline. There are huge tensions between different aspects of it. So recognising those tensions, not shying away from them, thinking through, well, why doesn't that bit fit with that? What else would we need to actually, kind of incorporate if we were to get a proper understanding of what's going on here? So really developing your interest in that particular way, I think is crucial. In terms of other things that you might do sort of outside academic work, things like voluntary work, a lot of students who are interested in psychology will, kind of go and volunteer in a hospital or in an old people's home or whatever, and that can be extremely valuable. But I think what you need to do as well is, again, not just do it for the sake of it. It's about thinking, right, okay, how would this fit in with what I learnt on my health psychology course, or why is this happening in this particular way? Might there be a different way of approaching this? So always questioning, always challenging.